What is the scariest book you have ever read? The Shining is like 3 horror novels happening in one. For Wendy, it's the terrifyingly simple fear of being trapped and isolated with a man who once loved you, who can't guarantee he won't hurt you. For Danny, it's being trapped with a force you can't explain to your parents and that parents can't protect you from. For Jack, it's slowly losing your mind whilst having awareness that you're losing your mind and that this will culminate in your loved ones being hurt. The topiary coming to life and attacking still gives me the creeps decades later. I mean, what could be more harmless than a bunch of topiary animals? Doctor Who's Weeping Angels is exactly how the living topiary should be handled theatrically. Barely perceptible movement and then they are on you and terrifying. Have yet to find any of the filmed versions worthy of the book. Kubrick nailed the atmosphere but screwed the story. Other versions kept faithful to the story, but failed to capture the atmosphere. If anyone manages to marry the two, it will be a killer combination. That's intriguing. I've never heard that one before. Something else a treasure about the structure of The Shining is that you don't necessarily need the ghosts for the story to work, and I think the theory about Wendy speaks to that. The ghosts could be Danny's hyperactive imagination as he tries to cope with this rough patch in his parents' marriage, or it could be Wendy spiraling as she's forced to spend inescapable time with Jack, or it could be Jack just fighting and losing a war with alcohol dependency. Schleif's brood are not scary but traumatizing. It starts with a fire in a church and the little drops from the pulpit and its head just bursts. While everyone is running out, the mother kneels next to her dead kid, pulls out its bloody teeth and kisses them as if they were the most precious jewels. My German teacher, who hated me, ordered me to read it and hold a presentation on it in 8th grade, while no one else had any such dark literature. Needless to say, that I hated him too and still do so till this very day, and it's one of my best motivations to become a better, more empathic teacher. There is an outtake from that movie that kills me every time. Thomas Jane is driving, Donnie Wahlberg is in the passenger seat, and Tom Sizemore is in the back seat. Donnie is trying to say the line "one worm kills world" and he's saying it with his accent reflecting the character's disability, so it's kind of slurred. Thomas is messing with him by asking questions about the worm not in the script, forcing Donnie to keep repeating the phrase over and over. Questions like, really? Just one worm the whole world? Is it like a regional thing? After about 4 or 5 questions, Donnie snaps and yells, "Dude, I told you already, one worm kills world." It's funny because he drops the accent for the first part but then puts the accent back on when he says one worm kills world. Tom then yells from the back asking how much further it was and Thomas snaps back at him, "Shut up, poem. You'll be dead in 5 minutes anyways," which then happens in the movie. It's also told from several different perspectives. There's the narrator /AskRedditStorie mentioned, as well as notes from a person who was doing a dissertation-like study on a documentary film about the house and evidence supposedly from that documentary. Part of what makes the book so haunting is the non-standard formatting. There are extensive footnotes, text in weird directions to mimic the impossible geometry of the house, even text that runs backwards that you have to read with a mirror. It's very absorbing and can be hard to follow and really wraps you up in the craziness experienced by the characters. I've gotten about 3/4 of the way through and think about attempting it fairly often. Maybe it's time. Trying to describe this book is my favorite exercise in futility. It's a book about a guy who may or may not be losing his grip on reality, going through a collection of notes about documentary that doesn't exist, which is about a house that doesn't exist, on a street that doesn't exist, which is bigger on the inside than on the outside, and may or may not be extremely haunted, or something along those lines. There are several layers to the entire story, between the story being described within the house, the story of the person who wrote the notes, and the story of the guy who's actually reading the notes. And I use the word story very loosely here. because it's certainly not structured like a story in any traditional sense. It's got multiple appendices, an index, and a boatload of footnotes, some containing entire stories, which sometimes have their own footnotes. House of Leaves is an experience, and I think that experience more closely resembles a drug-fueled descent into questioning your own sanity than reading a book. 10/10ths. The Strain by Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan, not necessarily the most horrifying story in terms of spooky stuff happening. The vampires are more fascinating than scary, but I read it in COVID times, and I found the implications of a society so dumb that it would crumble in the middle on a pandemic so chilly and so insanely close to what happened in modern times. Insanely rich people that would sacrifice the rest of the world just to be even more powerful, and still, people would cheer for them. Humanity's worst enemy is disinformation and the worship of the individual. The vampire overlord was the big bad, but it would never had succeeded if he wasn't aided by the human political infrastructure. Also, it has this lovely dialogue: there is a virus moving through the city. It's something ... extraordinary ... easily the worst thing I have ever seen. The worst? She blanched. Is it SARS? P.S. But the old Mexican luchador was lovely. Long live El Angel de Plata. Spoiler. The Last Children of Sanborn. It was required reading when I was in elementary school and I nearly threw up reading it, a post-apocalypse children's book about what happens after a nuclear explosion. Story starts with a visit to the grandparents' house when they witness a nuclear explosion on the way. The grandparents seem to have died early on from the explosion when they went out to the supermarket to shop for the visiting family. They are the lucky ones. The rest of the family survived, only to have sister dies from cancer. The mother dies after giving birth to a child without eyes, hands and feet. The boy himself is implied to have some symptoms from radiation. I don't care what the author said, this is not a children's novel. WTF. I think it was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. It was about a girl who was everyone saying it scared them, so for hopping on the Stephen King train, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that book wasn't really that scary. It was disturbing, yes, but it wasn't really scary. It's hard to get something to actually be scary when it's in book form, although you can get close by making it creepy and disturbing. So, going by that, the book that really got me creeped out and disturbed the most was The Outsider, also by Stephen King. That shit was downright messed up. It and Salem's Lot are tied for second place in my opinion. Want to find some recommendations other than Stephen King, who is great, but we all know his work. Great, me too. Cows by Matthew Stacco. I've never read something so vividly disgusting. The descriptions of stenches, stains, and bodily irregularities really come together to paint a strange but beautiful picture. Living Dead Girl by Elizabeth Scott, told from the perspective of a young girl who was kidnapped by a pedophile and is becoming increasingly aware that she's aging out of his interest. Terrifying and claustrophobic. Strangely, Elizabeth Scott seems to have primarily written near romance outside of this one. House of Secrets by Loaka Eel. Do you like true crime? If so, this one's a doozy. A lesser-known, covered case involving cults, incest, road trips, and murder. Shit's crazy. Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates. Jeffrey Dahmer but make it literature. Try by Dennis Cooper. Actually, you know what, pretty much anything by Dennis Cooper. Thanks for the descriptions of necrophilia that will forever haunt my dreams. Good sir. My grandmother got me a book of 50 classic fairy tales when I was 9. I thought it was gonna be Disney stuff, but nope, big nope, it was the original stuff. With graphic images too. I remember I flipped open to a random story and read, and at 9 years old that was the stuff of nightmares. A little poor orphan girl is walking at her mother's funeral when a rich old lady sees her and adopts her. She gets rid of her red shoes that the shoemaker for the peasants made her, because they aren't fit for her anymore, and they go shopping for new shoes. The girl sees a pair of beautiful red dancing shoes, but the lady doesn't let her buy them, because they aren't appropriate. I believe she needed to wear them for a church service or something. Well, the girl didn't listen. She took advantage of the fact that the old woman had very poor eyesight and bought the red shoes instead of the other pair. The next day when she puts them on, they make her feet dance by themselves, and she can't stop them. It takes like 3 people to pull them off her. She is an idiot, and soon she decides to wear them again. This time nobody pulls them off and she dances all night. The next day she knocks on the door of someone's house to ask for help, but the guy is actually an executioner, who wants to cut off her head with his axe because she has sinned and he can smell it on her. She begs him to forgive her and instead cut off her feet, which he agrees to. This is the part that traumatized me because the last page was the image of her cut off feet, blood and bone, still dancing away into the sunset with the red shoes on. Other notable mentions are one of the Jack the Giant Killer stories, where the giant cuts open his own stomach, and the book described his guts falling out when one of the characters walks into the room he isn't supposed to, and the book had an image of bloody skulls stacked in pyramids, a really freaky image of some cats performing a ritual that they do to take the most beautiful maiden in the village every year. It was mainly creepy because of the way the faces were drawn, staring into your fucking soul, and where they described a teenage boy's leg being cut off and thrown into a pot of soup by a cannibal couple. Thankfully, that specific one had no picture, as it happened to be a fake out cut. Still, the mental image I had while reading was disturbing. Those were the most immediate ones I could think of, but there were plenty more. As much as the book scared me as a child, I loved reading it. Maybe it was just morbid curiosity, who knows. I still enjoy popping it open sometimes and reading from it. Not as much as scary as it was deeply disturbing, but for me it's near the end of a book called Unwind. It's hard to explain put context of the rest of the book, but basically in this particular chapter it's going through the part of one of the characters being unwound, taken apart one body part and organ at a time, and it's so creepy since they're conscious the whole time, albeit heavily drugged at the same time. There's one part where the guy looks downish and sees that from the waist down everything has been removed and they're wheeling away the lower half of the gunnery, or whatever the name of the metal table thing people are on during surgery. Potential spoilers for World War Z. World War Z. It turned such a ludicrous concept like a zombie apocalypse and actually made it seem realistic. And I don't necessarily mean the way the zombies function, I mean how people and governments react, and it talks about all sorts of things you'd never even think about, like oil-rig divers needing to use atmospheric dive suits when working to protect from zombie attacks underwater, and how the French government still needs to send in special squads to clear the catacombs of zombies years after the crisis ended. Max Brooks thought of damn near everything when he wrote that book. I love how 2/3 of the answers are all Stephen King. The man is a genius. I'm going to go in a different direction. Will Store vs. the Supernatural by, funnily enough, Will Store and Hunt for the Skinwalker by Colm Kelleher and George Knapp. The first is a simple premise: can you prove or disprove the idea of some kind of life after death? WS talks to scientists, doctors, priests, ghost hunters, all in the name of trying to find the truth one way or the other about spirits. It's one of the best books I've ever read about the paranormal, but by God did it freak me out. I started it on the way home on the train from a day with friends and it was freaking me out, to the point where when I got home all the lights went on and I had to wait till the sun came up to go to sleep. The Skinwalker book deals with the goings-on at Skinwalker Ranch, which some of you may or may not be acquainted with. I know there's some dispute as to what exactly has gone on there, but I can't see Robert Bigelow and the US government forking over money to buy it if it was total bollocks. Really well written, doesn't sensationalize, The account it presents is sensational enough, and similarly to the Will Store book, I started reading this in broad daylight in a cafe while I was eating my lunch, and getting totally spooked out by it. I can't recommend both highly enough. Stephen King's Pet Sematary. I'm not usually susceptible to horror, but that book creeped me the fuck out. I was 21 when I read it, and I still recall switching off the bedroom light and spending the next half an hour peeking nervously around the room in between trying to fall asleep. Hats off to you, Mr. King. Your books don't always do it for me, but with Pet Sematary, if you wanted to spook me, then you succeeded far beyond your wildest dreams. Little Heaven by Nick Cutter stuck with me. There's a scene that involves a massacre in a church where the people drink cups of drain cleaner unknowingly. Cutter is a whiz at getting into the disgusting details so personally that you can almost feel and smell everything. He took pages and pages to describe the people puking their own stomach and throat tissue out, the dead people laying over the pews with their pants soiled from their deaths, the people's children screaming and crying while their parents died, the way the floor is covered in gore from the puking, the smell, everything. I was so disturbed that I had to hide the book from myself for days. After reading it, I almost felt like puking myself. I never expected a book to make me feel so sick. It's a great book, but it's certainly not an easy read. Watchers by Dean Koontz. One night I fell asleep reading it and woke up in the middle of the night to my golden retriever sitting very human-like at the window just staring out. It freaked me out. Haha. There's another book of his that I find even scarier, but I'm blanking on the name. It's about a couple and the man medically dies and is brought back to life by doctors. Edit. Hideaway is the name of the other book. This is gonna sound dumb, but it was a Goosebumps book. Granted, they don't read a lot these days. I'm pretty sure it was The Haunted School, but it's been years since I read any of those books. I don't remember any of the details, but I remember I was about halfway through it, all lights off except my bedside lamp, and the scene being described was so vivid in my mind I got sucked in way too hard. I had to put down the book. Never finished it, and I had trouble sleeping for the next week or so. Alright, now that embarrassing story's out of the way, I'm gonna comb the comments for something to grab on Audible. Trapped, the last book of R.L. Stine's original Fear Street series, sticks out as one of the scariest books of my childhood. Some teenagers play in the tunnels under their town, and this malevolent tread mist carries them off or disintegrates them or something. It made me want to check out the abandoned tunnels under my own city, but also creeped me TF out. Trapped, the last book of R.L. Stine's original Fear Street series, sticks out as one of the scariest books of my childhood. Some teenagers play in the tunnels under their town, and this malevolent tread mist carries them off or disintegrates them or something. It made me want to check out the abandoned tunnels under my own city, but also creeped me TF out. Pretty much the entire Jack Caffrey series by Mo Hader. They're brilliant, and not really close to horror, but they're typically unbelievably gruesome. The Treatment, which I think is the second book in the series, legitimately had me looking over my shoulder for the better part of a year whenever I was walking by myself in London, especially what winds up happening to his brother. Heartbreaking. The Exorcist, followed closely by a horror novel I've never been able to find. It's of a deaf teacher to teach her student a close adaptation of sign language not recognized internationally, but a bus of her and her students were waylaid and murdered one by one. She was about to get away, but because she had no hearing, she didn't hear the squishing of blood as she carefully walked across bodies until the murderer turned out the lights and she had to scream even though she never screamed before. It was a haunting novel. She was saved, and there was other parts, but I don't remember those as much. It might not be the scariest in a conventional way, but the manga Blood on the Tracks, Kite no Wadaki, is chilling. It's about a boy who's been abused and basically brainwashed by his mother, struggling with breaking free and being his own person and being the person he thinks his psychopathic mother wants him to be, with some super fun murder sprinkled in. It's still ongoing, but the artist is very talented in making these horrifyingly chilling faces and conveying emotion through them.